This is a report on Big Fish, a movie directed by Tim Burton. It is an adaptation of a novel written in 1998 by Daniel Wallace. The movie was released in 2003. The setting of this movie changes many times throughout. Exact years are hard to determine, but it is reasonable to assume the movie occurs between 1929 and 2000, give or take a couple years. A period of 71 years from Edward Bloom's birth to his death. The present-day real-life action seems to occur in autumn, while Edward's stories seem to occur in late spring or early summer. Big Fish is set primarily in the United States, mostly in unnamed or fictional towns, with the exception of one scene in North Korea and one scene in Paris. Most of the action is spread fairly evenly between the fictional towns of Ashton and Spectre, as well as the house Edward buys for his wife. This house is in an unknown location. All of the characters were born and raised in the United States, with the exception of Will's wife, who is from France, and the Korean twins. There is no historical information needed to understand this film, with the exception of conscription. Conscription, which is the forced military service of a nation's citizens, was used in the United States during the Korean War, which is why Edward Bloom had to join the military. The main plot, which only takes up 1/3 of the screen time, is as follows. Edward Bloom's son, Will, is getting married. Edward ends up telling a story which seems to center more around him than Will. They have a falling out and do not talk to each other for many years, until Will finds out that his father is dying. He moves back home from Paris to be with his father and mother. Will decides to reconcile his differences with his father. He wants to know the true events of his father's past, rather than the stories he has always been told. This does not happen. Their relationship becomes even more strained as Edward continues to tell his stories. But slowly, Will begins to find out that not everything his father said was a tall tale, and was indeed based in fact. He had always suspected that his father had an affair, and goes to Spectre to confront a woman whom he believes had an affair with his father. He finds out that his father never had an affair. Will returns home to discover that no one is home because his father is unconscious in the hospital. Will waits with his father at the hospital while everyone else goes home. Edward regains consciousness and asks Will to tell him the story of how he dies. Will tells his father the fantastic story of his death, and then Edward passes on. The next scene is of the funeral, and Will sees all of the people his father told the stories about. In the end, he realizes that his father has lived on in the stories he told, and so the stories are who he really was. The subplot of the story, which takes about 2/3 of the screen time, is the story of Edward Bloom's life as he told it. Most of it is in chronological order, with the exception of the first scene, which is the story of how Edward caught and released a huge fish on the day his son was born. His life was as follows. Edward Bloom is born in a fantastic fashion. Edward meets a witch when he is 10 and sees how he's going to die. Edward hits a growth spurt and is confined to his bed for 3 years. He reads that goldfish grow bigger in bigger ponds, and decides he needs to leave Ashton. He becomes the town hero. He meets Carl the giant and befriends him. They go out into the world. Edward decides to take an old road instead of the paved one because he thinks he may never be back there again. He stumbles into Spectre, a town that seems perfect. He meets the poet Norther Winslow, who left Ashton years ago and has never been heard from again. A little girl named Jenny takes his shoes so that he can't leave. Edward decides to leave anyway. Edward and Carl go to the circus, and Carl gets a job. Edward sees the love of his life, but has no idea who she is, so he works for the carnival master for 3 years until he finally gets told who she is. He finds Sandra Templeton at Auburn University, only to find out that she's engaged. Edward charms her into marrying him anyway. Edward is drafted into the Korean War. He is declared missing in action, but makes it back with Siamese twins. Edward becomes a traveling salesman and runs into Norther at a bank. Norther is robbing the bank. After they find out that the banks are bankrupt, Norther decides to go into the stock market. After he makes his first million, Norther sends a check to Edward, which Edward uses to buy his wife's dream house. Edward ends up back in Spectre, only to find that it is a ghost town. He sets up a trust with the help of the people he had helped make rich over the years to save Spectre. He needs the signatures of everyone in town to make it work, but one woman won't sell. It turns out to be Jenny, the little girl he had met before. He fixes her house, and she agrees to sell. The last scene is of Edward's death. He escapes from the hospital with the help of his son, Will. They drive down to the river and see everyone Edward has ever known. Will places Edward into the river, and he turns into a fish, symbolizing how he has become his stories. One of the themes in Big Fish is the importance of father-son relationships. It is the need for a true connection with his father that drives Will to try digging into his father's past. It is why he tries to dig through the layers of stories, and why he is ultimately satisfied with those stories when he realizes that the stories were who his father really was. The central theme of Big Fish is death, and how people can live on after they die. People's stories will survive them by many, many years. Will realizes this about his father in the end of the film.
That was my father's final joke, I guess. The man tells his stories so many times that he becomes the stories. They live on after him. And in that way, he becomes immortal.